One. Okay, welcome to the fourth edition of A Conversation with Graeme, and I've moved back into my comfort zone this week. So from the world of psychology last week, which was amazing, I'm back into an area that I hopefully know a little bit more about, given that I'm an author on a few of Jamie's publications. But I'm delighted we've got a former PhD student and now colleague of mine, Dr Jamie Pugh, today, who we're going to delve into the world of gut health. So thanks for joining us today, Jamie.
No, thanks very much. Only a little bit of pressure on me after the first three experts in all their fields, and yeah, hopefully I can do something as worthwhile and useful as those guys.
Well, look, I think gut health is something that has seen a monumental rise in interest over the last few years, and one of the reasons we started working on this is because of the amount of questions that we were getting from athletes and practitioners. But if we start right back at the basics, we all throw terminology around, don't we? And sometimes we never really think it through. So let's get this clarified from the start. What do we mean when we talk about gut health and an athlete's gut health?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a great question, because it's something that I've thought about and I've struggled with some of our research, and it's something that I get asked all of the time. And as you said, you see the term bandied around so often that, you know, an athlete or a practitioner, you know, they take probiotics for their gut health, or they do this for their gut health, without it actually meaning all that much. So as of yet, there's no real defined meaning for gut health. So I suppose it's just about then considering all of the different aspects of what the gastrointestinal system or the gut does within the body. So whether that means that it's just functioning properly, are you digesting and absorbing all of your food? Are you free from disease? So there's no clinical pathological underlying condition there. It's not causing you any undue life stress or perceived stress. You don't need to visit a clinician or a doctor. So there's so many facets of it that it's difficult to then narrow down into this one thing, especially when, as I said, in sports nutrition now, we know, for example, that the digestive tract does a lot more than just digest food. Now we know it plays in a role in immune function. We know it plays in a role in our mood and our cognitive state, and all of those other areas as well. So it's tough to put one definition on it.
So if we were going to try and define it and maybe move it to what is ideal gut health, would we be talking about an absence of symptoms both at rest and during physical activity?
I think at a minimum, I think the basic starting point would just be free from disease. Yeah. We were going to include, as I said, a number of high-profile athletes who over the years have been diagnosed or have been named as having an underlying condition. So even that as a starting point would be something. And then, as you said, from there it would probably be, fully functioning, absence of symptoms as well.
And I guess when we're talking about absence of symptoms, are we talking about ranging from just somebody who gets abdominal discomfort when running all the way through to like a Crohn's disease? Yeah,
absolutely. And it's when we started looking at some of this research, we saw, crazy numbers of how many, or what proportion of athletes suffered from symptoms, especially endurance athletes. And you see this big range in published studies from maybe 30% of athletes report symptoms all the way through to 90% of athletes in a race might report some sort of gut distress. But then when you get into the papers and you get into the data, you start to realize that actually some of these are recording a bit of gas or a burp, something like that. And so again, it's probably more about interpreting that severity of the symptom. And for different people, that's going to mean different things. For some people, a bit of gas is probably unwanted, whereas for some other people that might be perfectly fine. And I think that's where I said the perception of it as well becomes important for an athlete or individual.
Yeah, so maybe on that definition, we might need to include something on the lines of the absence of these symptoms, which would have resulted in an issue in everyday life or would have been a problem to performance. Yeah. So you'd say if somebody just breaks wind when we're running, so what, but if someone's constantly doing it and it's affecting the performance, then it becomes a gut health problem. Would you agree?
Yeah, listen, it's something that doesn't affect quality of life, and for us as working in sport, that doesn't affect performance as well. And those two are probably different and separate.
Yeah.
But as I said, for some individuals in clinical, in IBS patients, something for them might not mean that much to me and you, but for them could be causing them a huge amount of undue stress in their life. So it is about, like I said, working with an individual and managing their expectations and their perceptions as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point when people do quote that 90% of athletes suffer. We just need to delve into that paper a bit more and realise exactly what they mean by suffering. It takes me nicely on to the next question I had, which is, when I started off in sport nutrition, which isn't that long ago, contrary to popular belief, not many people were really talking about gut health. I remember in my days when I was working at Munster Rugby, the first time I'd ever heard the term FODMAP, and being embarrassed I'd not heard of it. Why do you think there's been a sudden increase in interest in gut health and what we can do in the sport nutrition profession to try and help it?
There's probably a few reasons. I think the interest and the increase in publications that have looked at the bacteria within our gut or the microbiome, I think that's led to a huge spark in interest, because it is such a novel area and it's such an unknown that it sort of gauge people's interest. And then cynically, I think the other side of it is because obviously there's such a commercial aspect to it. If you can create a probiotic product that somehow solves all of these new issues that we're all talking about, or if you can come up with a new diet or something like that. So I think there's probably a few reasons why there is such an increase. And even then, from a greater understanding of the role that the gut plays. So if you go back to the 80s and the early 90s, most of the research on the gut was almost purely on function. So it was, how quickly can we empty a drink from the stomach? How much carbohydrate can we absorb from the small intestines and use? And they're really, seminal, amazing papers, but they're all in that sort of similar area. And you start to see the progression where you then work through, and there's a strong period of time where all of the immune-based studies relating to probiotics in the gut started to come out, as we realize, actually, this is an area that if we target the gut, we can improve how often an athlete might get an upper respiratory tract infection. And so I think you always see this shift as our knowledge increases and our ability to study some of these things. And I think that's where we're up to at this point now. We know the gut plays a central role in so many of these areas that actually we can start to figure out, well, does it link to this or this or this or this, and how can we manipulate it to improve the outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of crossover there between other disciplines. I'm asked in my world of vitamin D a lot, why is there a sudden increase in vitamin D interest? And I always say it probably corresponds with the fact that we realised vitamin D was doing more than just regulate bone health, the immune function and muscle function. And I guess that's quite similar to what you're saying there, but rather than it just being this innate organ that we use for digestion and absorption, knowing that there's a huge interplay with the immune system, there's a barrier to pathogens, lots of exciting roles of the gut. A key term you mentioned then was the microbiome, and again, this is another term that we see bandied around a lot, but I don't know if anyone really fully understands. Can you just get us up to speed what we mean when we talk about the microbiome, please?
Yeah, so in general, what we tend to be talking about is just the bacteria, but it's important to mention that there are fungi and viruses within that. But most of the research to date has been just in bacteria that sits mostly in the large intestine of the digestive tract. So if you think about how fast things move through the digestive system, moves pretty quickly through the stomach, pretty quickly through the small intestine. Once you get to the large intestine, which sort of frames our abs, if you like, everything starts to slow down. And because then there's a lot of water, there's a lot of undigested food, it is just a harboring ground for bacteria. And not all of that is bad. I think bacteria might put thoughts in people's minds of something negative, but actually these exist in symbiosis with us. So we need them as much as they need us. And it is almost this internal organ. And then as they ferment foods, as they give off different metabolites, as I said, we've started to realize that even mechanistically, if you take all of the bacteria from an overweight animal and put it into a donor animal, that animal then becomes overweight. if you take the microbiome from a stressed animal and put it into a donut, that animal becomes stressed. So we know mechanistically, again, it has huge implications for many aspects of our existence. It's a difficult one to study because obviously access, as much as we can, we learned that we could take a biopsy from a muscle. It's pretty difficult to go and take a biopsy from someone's intestines. Yeah. So the only real access we have at the minute is a stool sample, and that can be quite awkward to get an athlete or an individual to give up one of those samples. But the other thing then is that we know that isn't a perfect picture of what's going on all the way throughout the intestinal system as well. So it's our best guess, but it's not ideal.
To expand on that a bit, Jamie, particularly that last bit, am I right in thinking that when you get a stool sample, you're kind of taking a picture of the last minute of a rugby game, for argument's sake, and you've not seen what's gone on in the other 79 minutes, or is that a little bit too oversimplified?
Yeah, it probably is too oversimplified, because it's not even to say that it's at that point it's the result of everything that's gone on before. But what's going on in the small intestines could be then completely different to what's going on there. And there have been some really cool studies been done where they have been able to take biopsies, and they've shown really nicely that actually what's going on, even in most of the large intestine, doesn't resemble or has very little relationship to what you see in a stool sample. So it's not to say it's a worthless measure, but as of yet, it's not perfect.
And what about variation? So what I mean by that is, if I was to give you a stool sample today, because I'm interested in my microbiome and I want to know, can I improve it? And then I went on a week of, let's say, a typical rugby week where I've maybe had a few beers, a few curries. I've maybe changed my diet for a bit that week, and then I give you one again next week. Would I see a similar microbiome, or do they? Have I got my own signature, I guess is what I'm saying, or is it very much dependent on what I have recently done?
Okay, there's a few bits there I'll try and get into. So the first one, when you're saying that, to make my microbiome healthier, that is quite a contentious issue. And as I said, most of these microbiome tests now are quite freely available. You can go online, order a test, send your sample, and get this data back. When actually, even in clinical populations, we don't really know what a healthy microbiome looks like. So we know, maybe some health associated patterns, but we're talking about thousands of species of bacteria that's, maybe changing quite rapidly. So it's difficult to sort of say what would a healthy microbiome look like compared to an unhealthy microbiome. How quickly it changes. If you'd have asked me a couple of months ago, I'd have said yes, definitely. If you can change it very quickly. The studies show it even in 24 hours, you can see measurable differences in your microbiome. You will retain a core of the bacteria there and a core functionality. So we have all got, if you like, our own microbiome fingerprint. So the subtle changes you can see quickly. What's came out in the last couple of months is actually, though, if you follow that up in 6 to 12 months time, even with those rapid onset changes, even if your diet then stays on, this new change that you've implemented, it will eventually just revert back to what it was at the start. Okay. So I thought that was really cool data when I saw it, as I said, only a few weeks ago. And it just shows, as I said, that yes, diet plays a role, but there is, it's affected by our mode of birth. Were we C-section or natural birth? Were we breastfed? Did we have antibiotics as a child? All of these things have probably shaped it to what it is today. So it does seem like it's pretty robust.
That's pretty incredible, isn't it? I know there's some research on, which we call it the athlete's microbiome, and people have looked at, I don't know if it's necessarily the right terminology to say, is there an ideal athlete's microbiome? Is there such thing as an athletic microbiome? And you kind of touched on it a bit there, but everyone's going to have their own signature. But are there certain ones where we could look at it and say, that's probably not conducive to be optimum for an athlete?
I don't know if we could say what would be optimum for an athlete and what wouldn't. We know that within sports teams, there does seem to be a shared core, if you like. So there's been some fantastic research out of Ireland, Orla O'Sullivan and Sharon Madigan and some of that research group, and they've shown that if you compare the very first one they did was the Irish rugby team. If you take the microbiome from that group of players and you compare it to a weight and age matched healthy group of males, they look different. You can separate them as two groups, and they've done that. They've done follow-up work since showing that even within sports you can see differences. What's going to be interesting moving forward is that because of their sport, is it because of the type of training they do, or is it just because they have similar lifestyles and the sport is just a confounding factor in that? Do they mostly eat the same type of foods because they've shared meals? Yes, they're all doing the same type of training. They all live in the same environment, exposed to the same amount of outdoor atmosphere. So they've probably got a lot of shared lifestyle factors. Mm-hmm. So it's tough, and it's really difficult to tease that apart, as I said, because there's so many things that affect it. So we know that, a group of athletes look different to another control group, or indeed an athletic group from another sport. Do we know yet what the microbiome of elite marathon runner should look like, or a Tour de France cyclist, or a rugby player look like? In my opinion, I think we're way off looking at that.
Okay, cool. Really, really, really interesting. I've also read. Sorry, I sound like I've read too much of a Daily Mail here instead of journals, which would be a terrible thing. But if we think of, there's lots of trending newspaper headlines about fecal transplants and actually having a microbiome that will be conducive for weight loss. Is there anything in that, in your opinion? Do you think, will we see a day when we're doing fecal transplants, and, is the microbiome associated with, body mass, etc.?
So early on, the initial studies, it looked like there maybe was, and you've got to think that these are grouping the bacteria at a genus level. So this isn't at species. This is, 3 or 4 orders above that. That yes, it looked like there were differences between overweight and healthy individuals. And you just skip forward a few years later, and that's completely gone out the window, because then other groups have found the complete opposite in that relationship. So it's difficult. As I said, the mechanistic studies in animals look really nice, and they're really simple. And yes, we know there's a causation there. In humans, it's just so much more complex. There was a really nice study that showed that probiotic supplements, for example, for 6 months had a significant effect on weight loss. I think when you then went into the paper, it was something like 1 pound in weight over 6 months.
Yeah.
So if it has a contributing factor, I think it's going to be small. I think for weight loss especially, it's still always going to be calories in, calories out.
Yeah. It's a bit like the fat burning pills. You're probably going to use more calories walking to a shop to buy the probiotics than what taking them would actually do in terms of fat loss.
Yeah. And like I said, maybe even the increase in metabolism from the stress of having to pay for them every month as well.
Yeah. Where I'm from Wigan, that would be a massive contributing factor to my stress, having to spend £30 a month on probiotics. But we'll move on. I want to switch a little bit now to some of your research, because I know it's something, we've talked in general. I think we've got a really good scene set of it, but what we're trying to do on these conversations with is not only give the generic, but show the novelty that's coming out of LJMU. And I know that your research started off by looking at the prevalence and severity of GI symptoms. And we said before that 30 to 90%. So in your hands, what type of numbers are you seeing? Is it a problem?
Yeah, do you know what? It's surprising that we found that it was much lower than that 90%. Ours was at the bottom end of that. So in recreational marathons, we found just less than 30% were reporting symptoms. Where we tried to make that novel is that we only then included moderate or worse symptoms. So we ranked them on a scale. Everything that was mild, low, almost insignificant, we just binned straight away. We're only interested in something that could either impair performance, or this was in recreational runners. If they weren't running it for a time, it was their first marathon and they just wanted to finish. Having symptoms is still going to affect your experience of completing it. And we found instead about 30%. What was interesting was about 40% of them also reported symptoms just in training as well. So they're probably two separate causes, or two different scenarios there. But it was interesting to see that actually all these people do this regular running, yet there's going to be a significant number of times per month where they report some sort of symptom.
Yeah. So once we'd established those some symptoms, the obvious question then is, what can we do about it, isn't it? Which led us nicely onto the collaboration with a good friend of mine, Andy Sparks at Edge Hill, when we borrowed his running track, or Edge Hill's running track, and got a variety of standard of runners to run a marathon, looking at symptoms, but also investigating probiotics to see, could probiotics, one, reduce symptoms, but two, have an ergogenic effect as well. So we're going to get into that, but before we do, can we just again define terminology? What do we mean by probiotics, and even if you can mention at the same time prebiotics, which are being talked about a lot at the moment?
Yeah, so probiotics, when we talk about this bacteria in the large intestine, probiotics are essentially just bacteria. What they are is that they're species and strains that have been selected and cultivated, manufactured, because we know, for example, they survive digestion in the stomach. We know they make it through the small intestines, and we know that they have some impact on health as well, some positive impact on health. So the technical definition is live bacteria that, when sufficient, adequate amounts, confer a health benefit to the host. Prebiotics then are separate in that they're not bacteria, they're just food, they're carbohydrates. They are almost undigestible carbohydrates to us that reach the large intestine, and then the bacteria themselves can feed on and ferment, and that's thought to then help the bacteria flourish. Okay. So in terms of supplementation, a lot of people now are talking about probiotics being almost an essential supplement for athletes. I think there's a lot of confusion then, because you look at a probiotic and there's different strains, there's different colony forming units from millions to billions to tens of billions, and then people say there's no point supplementing if we're not giving prebiotics with it as well. So in terms of them type of things, the strains, the numbers, what should we be looking for? It's really difficult, because probiotics are probably unlike any other supplement that we might take, because if we take vitamin D, as long as we know that it's vitamin D free, any benefits that have been found in research are probably then going to be applicable if we take this supplement. Same then if it's whey protein, omega-3 fish oil, all of that. Probiotics are all banded together because they are all bacteria. But the reality is they only share a small amount of benefits between all of these different strains and species. So yes, most or almost all probiotics will compete against pathogens, for example, in the gut. They'll all do that. But then some of the specific things, like, will they help, as you said at the start, we have the gut acts as a barrier to pathogens. Will they help support that barrier? Well, that's going to depend on what the strain is. So the general, if all else fails, is that you want something that probably has more than one species and strain in it, something that's in the 10 or 20 billion range per serving. But if you're going to then try and be specific, and you want to take a probiotic for a specific reason, or you want to try and improve something, I would then say, look, you need to go and see which actual products have been used in that research. So if we've got athletes that are flying overseas and we want to try and reduce the likelihood that they get traveler's diarrhea, it's probably not best practice to just say, let's just throw a probiotic in for the sake of it. I'd say you need to then go in and find, well, which ones have been shown to be beneficial for that. Same if it's to improve immune function over the winter, and all of those other things, or reduce symptoms. It probably has or does need to come to a point where we are looking at those in that type of way.
It's really interesting, and I think it's something that a lot of practitioners probably don't realise, that the benefits are strain specific, and maybe moving forward it would be good to see maybe companies selling specific strains, or making it very clear that this is a specific strain, and where the evidence here is for traveller's diarrhea, for example.
Yeah, and it probably hits home when you start to think about it. It's one of the things. So I helped contribute to a position stand on probiotics a couple of months ago, and in there it was really clearly outlined to say we actually share more of our genetic basis with a banana than most probiotics share with each other. So if you think we're in the high 90s with, you know, other primates and things like this, even a probiotic that's in the same species might only share 70% of its DNA with another.
Yeah. Do you know what? This really gets, you know, people have probably seen about the paper we wrote, the paper to podium, which is all about making sure that we understand the research and are able to apply it properly. And I think this is a perfect example where we may see somebody do an infographic on probiotics improving travelers' diarrhea, but until we understand the strain, the species, the number of colony forming units, to just lump it together and say, take a probiotic, that's going to help you, is almost, you know, shooting in the dark, isn't it?
Yeah, and you know what, pragmatically, it's difficult because there might be licensing issues that stop us looking at one probiotic versus another. You know, and all these issues, it is difficult to study different probiotics against each other. And even when you're asking about the dose of probiotic to use, most of the studies don't use, and you know, we're guilty of this in our studies, don't tend to use any sort of dose response. It's normally just, okay, that dose was used once in this scenario and it's beneficial, we'll also use that. And that's the, you know, that's the way we went with our design. The probiotic we used in IBS patients reduced symptoms there at a certain dosage. So we just then transferred that dosage to our athletic studies.
Given that these are live bacteria, you know, on the bottle it says 20 billion CFUs. Well, clearly no one's counted them, but how do we know that in that there is 20 billion in there? You know, could there be more? Could there be less? Do they go off? You know, what is in the actual tablet that we're drinking or drink that we're drinking?
So the companies that produce them, manufacture them, they will have to have shown the viability of those bacteria and those strains. And what they have to do is they have to show that to the best before date that's on the packet, that number of live bacteria need to be in there at that date. So I've said it before, whenever, you know, from the manufacturers that helped us, they tend to not send us a best before bottle, if you like. They send us our own research use ones and tell us, look, you need to use this within a month, because actually the ones on the shelves in a store, they might have double the amount on the label because there will be some drop off over time. So so as long as it's within the date that's on the bottle, it should, conforming to the manufacturing standards, have that amount in it. So the best bet is to go and get one that's still got 2 years on it, because you're probably doubling your dose.
Yeah, so you could have if you want to take 20 billion CFUs, you could buy a brand new strain of 10 billion and save yourself half price.
As long as it's just come out of the manufacturers,
yeah. But we're not recommending to do that. But that's really interesting. So actually, it's a good thing from the manufacturers that they're making sure that by the best before, there is actually what's the minimum amount. So, you know, that's actually quite a positive thing to you. I want to move on to our research now, Jamie. So, you know, I'll let you summarize it. You know, what were the headline findings of that marathon study?
That I came away from that day sweating, stressed, the most stressful day. I don't even think just of the PhD, but possibly of my life. That was a long day, wasn't it? But
you're not wrong.
It was, do you know what? It was a great study to do. And as you said, essentially what we did is we got these volunteers, these participants, to run a full marathon, but on an athletics track. So that's just over 105 laps of an athletics track. But what it meant is that we standardized everything. So it was a competitive race. So it's, you know, it had probably the benefits of a lab study and a field study, because everything was controlled. We gave all of the participants a standardized diet the day before. They all reported to the lab early in the morning for a standardized breakfast. We could then take muscle biopsies, we took blood samples, all of that, fair play to the participants, and then they had to go and run a marathon, you know, just like as you do, just nice and easy. And then throughout that race, we could, again, standardize how much fluid they took on, how much carbohydrate they took on, and we could then measure lots of different things. What we'd done beforehand is split them up into two groups. One group supplementing with a probiotic, the other group supplementing with a placebo. So the main aim of the study was to see, could the probiotic reduce symptoms? And yes, we took its biological samples to try and tease out some mechanisms at the end. But first and foremost, we just wanted to see, would this be beneficial to your everyday runner? And they said our competitive range was from someone who took about 5 hours to run the marathon, all the way through to guys who run it about 2.5 hours. So, sub-elite marathon runners as well, really good standard.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things there before we move on to the results. The first one is, you've said it before, so come on, let's put you on the spot. What was the specific strains? We can't just say probiotics. What were we giving our participants?
So the commercial product we used was one that's called Lab 4. So that's 4 different strains: 2 lactobacillus acidophilus strains, 2 bifidobacterium. You put me on the spot for the strains. The strains are all CUL and then a number. I can't think of the number.
I think that's good enough for me. So lacto and a bifido, basically.
Yeah, and as I said, these are the only ones with the strain CUL and then a number. And like I said, that identifies the strain. All of them were supplementing with 25 billion per day. And as I said before, that was purely based on previous research with this specific product that has shown in IBS patients to reduce their symptoms over a similar period of time that we studied them for. So they supplemented for 4 weeks, and we measured their symptoms every day in that point as well. And even in training, we saw a reduction in symptoms when we came to look at the results. So before we got to the marathon race itself, the severity of symptoms in the probiotic group in the second 2 weeks of supplementing had significantly reduced. So yes, it wasn't chronic, it wasn't very prevalent, but the ones that did have some symptoms, they reduced in their severity even before they got to the start line, which is for any athlete would be some.
And this was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, all the standard stuff that you'd expect of a supplement study.
Okay, so then what about during the marathon itself? So
what we tend to see is that, and what you would expect in a marathon or any long-distance race, symptoms progress the further you go, the longer you're running for. So it's not like anyone starts running and then tends to develop these symptoms straight away. What we saw was a pattern, is that as the race progressed, the severity of symptoms got worse and worse and worse. So on a scale of 0 to 10, 1s and 2s at the beginning, 3 to 5 at the midway point, and that final third, we had a bit of a range from maybe 4 all the way through to 10. And then we tracked the symptoms in the probiotic group and the placebo group. The symptoms in the probiotic group seemed to level off, so there wasn't any further increase from about halfway onwards, whereas in the placebo group it did continue to increase. So the overall severity was lower in the probiotic group against the placebo group. What we didn't expect to see was that seemed to correlate with how well they were able to maintain their pace. Yeah. So as I said, because it was on a track, we literally timed every single lap, and then we could plot that to see what happened to their pace. And in most people, you saw this typical pace profile that, in any endurance race, where there's a fast start, slows down, levels off, and then maybe a bit of a sprint finish at the end. But if we look at all of the pace in that final third of the race, it was significantly slower, and the decline was greater in the placebo group compared to the probiotics. We can't claim any causality, but if you look then at how badly someone was suffering with gut symptoms compared to how much they slowed down, there did seem to be a bit of a relationship there. So they said the word, and it makes sense in a way. If you've got really bad guts, if you're cramping, you are probably going to find it difficult to maintain how fast you're running.
Yeah, so not necessarily an ergogenic aid, we would say, but a potential to maybe preserve intensity. Would that be a better way to describe it?
Possibly. And I said, even if it's just that, look, one of the reasons that you might slow down is because you get symptoms. So if there's no true physiological, in the same way that we might expect caffeine or something like that to maintain or maintain intensity, even if we can just delay or reduce symptom severity, and that could be a cause of why you slow down, then as you said, it's probably not a true ergogenic aid in that sense then, but it indirectly could improve your performance.
So how can probiotics help to reduce these symptoms? I think we can say that, I think we can all get our head around, if you're not feeling symptomatic in the gut, we can kind of work out how you can then perform better. But what's the mechanisms by which the probiotics would reduce them symptoms?
To answer that, we need to go back and, as I said, and just revisit the fact that there's so many things, and there's so many things going on and interplaying. So one of the things that we tried to tease out in my thesis were, what are all the contributing factors or potential causative factors for symptoms? And when we put that down on paper, there's a lot. There's so many things that could do. And then what we try to do is tease then, okay, well, where could probiotics fit in this? So one of the areas that we looked at in the marathon study was, could you reduce the damage that exercise does to the lining of the gut? So if you imagine the gut isn't this smooth layer, it's literally cell next to cell next to cell next to cell next to cell. All of these cells are held together by proteins, and we know that if you exercise, these proteins damage, and you get an increase in the gap essentially between them. Just by that happening and things getting across that we wouldn't normally expect to, you can have a large inflammation response to that. That's one of the ways in which you can get symptoms. That's one of the things we looked at in the marathon study, and actually we found that probiotics didn't, in this instance, seem to be protective. So even though that's one way you can cause symptoms, we don't think that's how the probiotics worked. Then you've got the issues of any psychological issues. I'm sure you've seen in team sports that you might not have symptoms all throughout the training week, and then 1 hour before the big game, all of a sudden the lads, that psychological stress can have a role. So that's an area, and it's something that it's with a few studies we've got ongoing at the minute to see if that's one of the ways that probiotics work. And then the other one is, maybe probiotics can just help us absorb more carbohydrates. So all of those classic papers, we know that there's a rate limiting effect in the small intestine of how much you can absorb. And, traditionally it's 60 grams of glucose, or up to 90 grams if we combine glucose with another carbohydrate like fructose. But even though that's the maximum reported, you do then see a range. So not everyone gets up to that physiological limit. So maybe it's just that some people don't seem to absorb these carbohydrates as well. And that's then one of the studies that we took back to the lab, and we tested this to see, look, if you then supplement with probiotics, can you better absorb and maximally use carbohydrates that you consume during a race or exercise?
Yeah, I remember when you first said that to me, that there's evidence that probiotics can help with exogenous glucose oxidation. I'll be honest, I was very skeptical. You'd skimmed the papers done in animals, and I'll be honest, I wasn't buying it. But we got a bit of extra funding, didn't we? Do some tracer studies, and then took it back to the lab to fully investigate that. And that data's now out, isn't it, in American Journal of Physiology? Which, tell us, what did we find?
Yeah, it's, if we were open and honest to begin with, the results are statistically significant. In that, yes, when this group of cyclists had supplemented with probiotics, the maximal amount of carbohydrates they could use increased by the end of exercise. So we asked that we get them to drink, I think it was about 80 grams of glucose per hour, which is a lot. And then we saw how much by the end of exercise of that 80 grams were they using. Is that we can use stabilized subtracers to pretty much track that drink from bottle to muscle and back out again. And we saw an increase, and we saw an increase in overall metabolism as well. So they were more dependent on carbohydrates, which some would argue makes them more metabolically efficient. It costs less oxygen to burn that carbohydrate than does to use fat. As I said, the difference was small if we hold our hands up, and similar though to other practical strategies that have been published recently. So I think there's been some nice work showing that if you take small sips as opposed to taking larger amounts of carbohydrate on board, the larger volume seems to increase how much you use. The difference that we see is almost exactly the same as that. So as I said, we're never talking about huge increases anyway in any of these studies. I think to do that, you'd probably need to train the gut. You'd need to be feeding carbohydrates regularly to get an increase in the receptors and the transporters in the small intestine. But as I said, it's significant, and that led us on then down to some of the more recent work, which we've not long finished, and we're in the middle of analysing, writing up to see, okay, can we confirm those findings? Can we see if that effect holds true in runners? And as we said, we tend to see more symptoms in runners compared to cyclists. So does that also in the lab result in a reduction of symptoms as well?
Are we limited to divulge what we're seeing at the moment? Does it appear to be holding true in runners, or is it a phenomenon that's reserved for the cycling?
I think the early results we've had so far is that there is some effect. I think we need to play around the statistics and see. Not, I shouldn't say play around run the statistics properly, yeah. Make sure that it holds out there. But on first glance, it's a very similar pattern. Okay. Where we're seeing this small beneficial effect of probiotics.
So, in terms of translation, I know that like most of the sports science staff at Jamie, you're also really keen on, as well as the research and the teaching, working with athletes. And I know you've done a lot of work with the New Balance team, and particularly Johnny Mellor. Has he tried any of these strategies, and have we seen any performance benefits?
Yeah, and it's, as you said, it's one of the unbelievable things about working at John Moores, isn't it? Because you get access to all these different lab techniques that are going to be beneficial for an athlete. And the reason that we started working with Johnny especially is because he's a phenomenal marathon runner. I think his average times over the last few years puts him in that top 10 Brits ever. But what he was finding that he was slowing down at the end of races, and he was getting large amounts of gut issues. He was really struggling to take on board his drinks. So what we were able to do, we brought him into the lab first of all, and a bit like with the cyclists and the runners, we got him up, running on the treadmill, drinking the drinks in the same way that he would during his marathon races, and we just wanted to see, is he able to use these drinks? Is he getting gut issues because he's not able to use all the carbohydrates? And sort of frustratingly, in some ways, we found that it wasn't that at all, because he was so efficient at using the drinks, which is good. And but it's difficult because you have to go back through and tease, well, why else might he be having these issues? But the big thing for us is that it reassured him completely, because he now knew, well, look, if he takes on all of these drinks during a race, it's not just sitting in his stomach, it's not just sitting in his gut and giving him these stitches and making him bloated. It must be something else. And, it gives him the confidence to really have an aggressive carbohydrate strategy during the races. And we brought him back in, and he wanted to try other things. We looked at the use of gels versus drinks, and all of this information really fed back into his strategy. And with a few other little things we did, we delved into the literature. We looked at some of these gut training strategies and how much he was taking on during his runs and periodizing that throughout his training cycle. And all of that led to, as I said, he ran early this spring, European marathon, PB'd by about 3 minutes, hit the Olympic standard, no issues whatsoever. And I think his splits, all of his 5K splits was something, I think, like 1 second out. So absolute metronomic running. So full kudos to obviously him and Steve Verner, his coaching team and things like that. But it was just one small part of the puzzle, because we could give him the confidence to say, you don't need to worry and stress about this. You can aggressively feed the carbs during the race. And like I said, Johnny's just one of the athletes who worked in that team. We've done that then with other members of that team, other GB athletes. And as I said, it's the techniques and the knowledge that we can then transfer to them.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. I've said a couple of times, it's paper to podium, the mantra that we have a lot about taking the research, trying to translate it to the athlete, but also then collect more data on the athlete, bring it back to the lab, and really try and use our research to drive winning strategies. And a lot of your research I've used myself in the team sports where I advise. We're looking at probiotics and how we can help. And okay, it's anecdotal, but we do seem to be having a good effect using the lab-based research in the real world. Look, I'm conscious that we've been on here a long time now, and hopefully there's some people still with us. But if we're trying to wrap this up a little bit, and I'm thinking about the practitioner now, what take-home advice can we give to a practitioner when it comes to gut function, and if they suspect any symptoms, and if they do, any strategies, what can we do to help?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think if we just, the first thing then, as you said, and symptoms is part of it, is know your outcome. And that's maybe where the difficulty is, and that's the skill of us for a practitioner across almost every aspect of our job, isn't it? But know your outcome. I said, instead of thinking, okay, let's improve gut health, you need to be a bit more specific than that and say, right, do we want to use the gut as a way to improve immune function over winter? And then I'm sure, as everybody does, assess that, evaluate it, and look to see has it worked or has it not worked. So if you know your outcome, you can then go about which target you want to approach. If your outcome is we need to reduce symptoms because it's something that we've seen or we've got an athlete presenting, you can then start to focus your efforts a little bit. So with symptoms, it's about just almost being investigative to see what could it be. Could it be psychological? Could it be dietary related, exercise related? The most important thing is if it's consistent, and we've certainly had cases of this where, I've been asked to come in and consult for an athlete. We've tried a couple of things, but even after 2 weeks, it's become apparent that we need to refer here to just rule out any underlying pathologies. And as I've said a couple of times, there are a lot of high profile athletes that have had these. As much as we want to think that, athletes, once they've got to this position, surely none of them would have these debilitating illnesses. But there are so many cases where it's been shown that they have. And I think there are quite a few of them actually that went undiagnosed for a number of years because they maybe thought it was just part and parcel of being an athlete, or, this is just something that happens with hard exercise or happens when I'm pushing myself. So I think education is definitely part of it. It's something that me, you, and Rob Ferner are really trying to champion a little bit in saying that, there does need to be some athlete education in that for the small minority, if you do have persistent symptoms, this is something you need to go and follow up on, maybe go for some sort of screening. So as I said, consider all the reasons why you could be getting symptoms. You might go down the road of FODMAPs, probiotics, all these things that we talked about. But if your strategy doesn't seem to be working and the symptoms are persistent, it's so important then to go out and refer.
Okay, so I was making some notes then, and I think we can summarize that is 1, educate, so the athletes know that it's a conversation we can have. A lot of people might not want to talk about the bowel habits, but let's just make this a complete non-taboo. Educate, talk about it. 2, identify and have the ability to identify symptoms from a little bit of discomfort. 3, refer if needed, and that referral can either be clinical, FODMAP dietitian, something like that. And then 4, support. If there are certain things we can do to support, whether it be probiotics or looking at the exogenous carbohydrate strategy, all the different things that we know from a nutrition perspective can help, then we can help. So a simple 4-stage strategy. Would you say that's a reasonable summary?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's some good examples that we've shown in the last few years of that type of approach.
Okay, well, look, I think that's a great way to finish it. Jamie, massive thanks for your time. It's great to see someone who's come through the JMU system, now carving out their own academic career. And, I've actually made some notes myself of a few things that I've learned in that conversation, despite being a co-author and working with you for many years now. So thanks very much, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as me.
No, cheers, Graeme. And as you said, anyone that is still listening, thank you very much for giving us the time.